Hi everyone and welcome to another video. My name is Richard Seidlitz and I'm the owner of redpants.lol. This is another entry in my series of videos about buying, maintaining, and ownership in general of the 2005 to 2018 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. In this video, I'll be talking about transmissions. I was originally going to include information about maintenance, clutches, and gear oils as well, but it ended up being way too long, so I decided to split the information into two videos. This video will be just about transmissions, and my next video will be about maintenance, specifically in regard to clutches and gear oil and why your choice of each one of those matters. Each video will reference the other, so make sure you watch both videos to get all the information. Now, anyone that decides to look into these cars will ultimately come across Aston Martin's long-standing reputation for bad transmissions and faulty clutches. What's out there is a mix of actual facts, a bunch of misunderstandings, and some erroneous hearsay, and I'm going to do my best to set things straight as best as I can in these two videos. Some of the information applies to just the manual transmissions, some just to the Sportshift, and some to both. So it'll be a good idea to listen all the way through as I'll be going back and forth between them depending on what I'm discussing. I'm also not going to get into technical details or anything like that. If you're looking for gear ratios and shift times or any kind of specs, I'm pretty sure Google will have it covered. And frankly, none of that has a meaningful impact on real-world driving and ownership, which is what we're concerned about right now. All that said, grab yourself a drink and get comfy, and we'll break all this stuff down so you know what's really going on with Aston Martin's transmissions. First things first, let's go over a couple basic things. There are two primary transmission choices for the V8 Vantage, the manual and Sportshift. The manual is a 6-speed Transaxle made by Graziano. The Sportshift is also a Graziano manual transmission, but it uses solenoids and hydraulics to shift for you. That's right, the Sportshift is an automated manual, not an automatic, and I will get more into that later. There are actually two Sportshift transmissions used in the V8 Vantage, Sportshift 1 and Sportshift 2. Sportshift 1 is the 6-speed flappy paddle transmission used in the standard V8 Vantage. Sportshift 2 is the 7-speed flappy paddle transmission that was used in the V8 Vantage S, N430, and GT. There are actually 5 transmissions for this generation of Vantage platform in total. The other two are the 7-speed Sportshift 3 and the 7-speed dogleg manual, which is actually a manual version of the Sportshift 3. But these are only used on the V12 Vantage S, so they don't apply to discussion about the V8 Vantage. The current generation Vantage, also called the New Vantage or AM6 Vantage, uses a ZF or ZF automatic transmission. This also doesn't apply to the cars we're discussing, so I won't get into that one either. The Sportshift 1 and Sportshift 2 have their differences, but for most of this video, I'll refer to both of them collectively as the Sportshift, as much as the information for them is generally the same until you get into that technical stuff like the gear ratios. The Sportshift is also called ASM, which stands for Auto Shift Manual. This should not be confused with the ASM mode of the transmission used in the V12 Vanquish. This was on its way out of production when the V8 Vantage was introduced. And this, my friends, brings us to the first bit of misinformation that we need to clarify. Much of Aston Martin's bad reputation for transmissions with the general public can be traced back to a Top Gear video in which Jeremy Clarkson compared a V12 Vanquish S against a Ferrari 575. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen it, but if you haven't, I've got a link to it in the description below. He basically had a bunch of transmission issues and said the car would have been great if it had a decent gearbox in it. Now, just like the V8 Vantage that we're discussing, that car had a paddle-shifted automated manual transmission with a single plate clutch. It had two primary driving modes, SSM, which stood for Select Shift Manual Mode, which was the driver-controlled way of driving it, or ASM, which was the computer-controlled automatic shift mode. So while ASM was a paddle-shifting mode for the previous flappy paddle transmission in the V12 Vanquish, ASM is the flappy paddle transmission itself in the V8 Vantage. These are two completely different things even though they have the same acronym. Next, the automated manual transmission in the V12 Vanquish and the one in the V8 Vantage are not at all the same. The big obvious difference is the gearbox used in each. The V12 Vanquish transmission was supplied by Tremec, and it bolted to the rear of the engine. The V8 Vantage transmission was supplied by Graziano, and it's a rear-mounted transaxle. It's not actually bolted directly to the engine. If you're not aware, a transaxle is a transmission that also incorporates a differential. That's not terribly important to most people, and it's one of those technical things that you can look into, but for this conversation, it's a critical thing to know for maintenance, and that's something I'll cover in my next video when talking about gear oils. Anyway, what all that means is that even though both the V12 Vanquish and the V8 Vantage use an automated manual transmission with a single plate clutch, the two systems are entirely different. Just as each of those is different than other types of automated manuals like BMW's SMG, Ferrari's F1, and Lamborghini's E-Gear. That V12 Vanquish transmission turned a lot of people away from the car and from Aston Martin in general. It was so unlike that Aston Martin eventually offered a factory retrofit to convert those cars to a manual transmission, the cost of which was said to be around $35,000. Unfortunately for Aston Martin, concerns about the V12 Vanquish's transmission continued to haunt them despite introducing a completely new automated manual for the V8 Vantage, which was the Sportshift. I've called the Sportshift transmission an automated manual many times already so far, but we're going to break this down Barney style to make sure that there's absolutely no confusion here, because this is one of the biggest issues that most people seem to have with the Sportshift equipped V8 Vantage, and it's another huge bit of misunderstanding. We need to clarify the difference between automatic and automated. The Sportshift is not an automatic transmission. It's an automated manual transmission. You will see a Sportshift car called an automatic pretty much constantly. It'll be listed as an automatic in sale ads and classifieds. There's an auto mode for the Sportshift transmission while driving. People will casually refer to it as an automatic during conversation. And all of that is perfectly fine. But you must understand that the Sportshift is not actually an automatic transmission. Automatic transmissions have torque converters. Manuals have clutches. The Sportshift does not have a torque converter. It does have a clutch. This is incredibly important because it will affect a person's opinion of the car both in ownership and driving enjoyment. The ownership aspect is easy to explain. You need to maintain a Sportshift transmission the same way as you maintain a manual transmission. Torque converters used in automatic transmissions last an incredibly long time, but clutches wear out and need to be replaced every 25 to 75,000 miles, with that range accounting for a number of variables. Clutches can cost several $1,000s to replace in these cars, so that does figure into things. You've also got gear oil, which is also called transmission fluid, and that needs to be replaced every 40,000 miles, as opposed to automatic transmission fluid, or ATF, that usually lasts 100,000 miles or many more. Gear oil is really easy to replace, and I have all the parts and supplies to do the job, plus DIY guides and a video showing you how to do it on Red Pants, so don't be worried about gear oil. I'll cover all this stuff about clutches and gear oil in my next video. That ownership bit is easy to explain, but driving a Sportshift takes a lot more discussion to understand, and this brings us to some do's, don'ts, tips, and tricks for these transmissions. Since we're on the Sportshift already, let's talk about that one, and then we'll talk about the manual transmission. The bottom line up front is the Sportshift has been much maligned because people do not understand it, especially people that expect it to work as an automatic. When people see the auto mode, they may think that's going to be the smooth and comfortable way to drive around in the car, like when you're putting around town, but that could not be further from the truth. Auto mode is very clunky, so if you want smooth shifts, drive it like a manual. Shift the car yourself using the paddles and lift off on throttle at least a little bit while shifting. If you want outright performance, just stay buried into throttle during shifts. It'll change gears hard and fast for you. There are two shifting modes for the Sportshift, which are Comfort and Sport. Even though Comfort mode does have a smoother shift than Sport mode, again, it's still clunky and you'll want to shift yourself, just like I mentioned if you want those smooth shifts. Computer-controlled automatic shifting will behave differently and feel differently between Comfort and Sport, and there are two main differences between these two modes that you need to know about in addition to this. First is that the shifts are slower in Comfort than they are in Sport. Second is the transmission will automatically shift up into a higher gear at 7,100 RPMs in Comfort mode, while the transmission will not automatically shift up in Sport mode. In Sport mode, it will hold the gear at redline. While the transmission behaves differently in each mode at the top of the RPM range, they behave the same at the bottom of the RPM range. In both Comfort and Sport mode, the transmission will automatically shift to a lower gear in low RPMs to prevent the engine from stalling. Another thing to know about shifting the Sportshift is that you can switch as many gears as you'd like at the same time. For example, if you wanted to drop from 6th gear down to 3rd, you can slap the flaps a few times and it'll jump all the way there, so long as it's safe. Even though you can theoretically skip as many gears as you'd like, the transmission will only skip as many gears as are safe to skip. For example, if dropping from 6th gear down to 3rd would result in the engine over-revving to 8,000 RPMs, the transmission will only drop down to 4th gear. Aside from how to drive it, there are a couple more things to know about the Sportshift transmission. One of these things is the clutch learn procedure, which is sometimes called the startup clutch kiss. When you first start the engine after the car's been sitting for a while and the engine's gotten cold, you should let it sit there and idle in neutral for 10 seconds before you press any buttons or paddles to select a gear. During these 10 seconds, the Transmission Control Unit, or TCU, will close the clutch and take a reading for when the prop shaft starts to turn. Basically, it's checking to see at what point the clutch is engaging. The TCU uses that reading to update its settings to account for clutch wear. This process happens automatically so long as you don't touch anything, and should be done every time the car is started from cold, and failure to do so can result in rougher shifting and accelerated clutch wear. The last thing I'm going to talk about that's specific to the Sportshift before moving on to the manual is the crawl function, which is also sometimes called creep mode, not to be confused with stalking somebody on Facebook. The crawl function kicks in when the transmission is in either first or reverse gear, you're not using the brake pedal or handbrake, and you're not giving the car any gas. The crawl function gives a tiny amount of power, just enough to get the car moving on a flat surface. If the car is on a gentle slope, that small amount of power will be just enough to hold the car in place. If the car is on a steeper slope, that small amount of power will not be enough to even keep the car in place, and it may roll downhill. So a couple things to know here. The crawl function can put a lot of wear and tear on your clutch. And if you're on a slope that's too steep for the crawl function to hold the car in place, you'll need to either use the handbrake to hold the car in place yourself, or start giving it some gas before the car can roll backwards. Okay, so all of that seems pretty convoluted because it's basically re-explaining everything you need to know to drive a manual car all over again, but also adapting everything for an added computer control system and lack of clutch pedal. Meanwhile, the manual is far more simple. But again, it's an Aston Martin, so there are some very important things to know specifically for these cars, even if you're fully capable of driving a manual. The common thing that messes people up is the high engagement point of the clutch pedal. Like pretty much any manual car, the clutch pedal has to be pressed all the way down to the floor when turning the car on. When shifting, however, you don't need to press the clutch pedal that far down. The high engagement point means you can blip the clutch pedal and shift, resulting in quicker shift times. Listen to the engine in this video so you can hear how quick the shifts can be. This was me in my manual 2007 V8 Vantage during a track day at NC Car in North Carolina some years ago. You can hear how quick the shifts are despite being a manual transmission, and that was back when I still had the standard clutch and flywheel setup before switching over to the lightweight setup that I have now, which I'll be talking about in my next video. By having a high engagement point, the clutch can be released and re-engaged quickly. This allows for quick shifts, and quick shifts keep the engine in higher RPMs when shifting, and that's where the engine has the most power. This is all great for performance, but even if you don't care about that aspect of things, the high engagement point is extremely important to understand. One of the reasons why clutches don't often last long in these cars is because of how people shift. I've seen this time and time again when riding in other people's cars and when I let people drive mine. Because people don't realize how high the engagement point is for the clutch, they'll push the clutch pedal in really far and then get on the gas too early before the clutch pedal gets high enough for the clutch to fully re-engage. That burns up the clutch pretty badly, especially in spirited driving when you're really getting on the gas. So regardless of whether you've been driving manuals your whole life or you're still somewhat new to them, I'd highly suggest going back to the basics and learning how to drive this manual. Practice feeling the clutch pedal, especially in regard to where the clutch is released and re-engaged. A quick little interjection just to clarify any continuity issues you may notice. I've had to refilm this point on in the video several times over the last 2 days because I keep having camera and microphone issues. So if you notice any lighting, sound, or beverage changes, I just wanted to clear up what happened. The good news is, the silver lining here, is that I was able to change some of the way I filmed it to give more information and to clarify a couple other things a bit better. So if anything, we may end up with a better video. All right. That out of the way, let's continue. The other big thing to know for the manual is a warning: do not overshift. The manual transmission is operated by a pair of cables that run parallel between the gear shifter in the cabin and a bell crank lever on top of the transmission at the rear of the car. The cables are attached with a ball and a socket connection. That is, a socket at one end of the cable snaps onto a ball on the gear shift, and same thing with connections at the transmission end. If you shift too hard, it's possible to pop that socket off the ball, which means the shifter cable no longer attaches the gear shift and the transmission. Even worse, doing this can crack or break the socket, so that means the cable will have to be replaced. And trust me, this can happen. I was on a small rally with a group of friends when I admittedly shifted way too hard and popped one of my shifter cables loose. I was stuck in neutral and my knob went limp, which luckily doesn't happen too often in other situations. A buddy of mine called AAA and they sent a flatbed truck to retrieve my car. Luckily, I was aware of the potential shifter cable issue, so while we were waiting for the flatbed truck, I pulled open the console inside my car to check the shifter cable connections at the gear shifter. They were fine, but I couldn't get underneath my car to check the other end of those cables at the transmission. So when the flatbed truck arrived, I asked the driver to let me try something. I asked him to lift up the front of my car so I could get underneath. He agreed, and I got under my car, which was blazing hot from all the driving we'd been doing, and I was laying on top of the pavement, which was also blazing hot because it was so freaking hot that day. I reached up between the exhaust pipes and the transmission to feel around for the shifter cables, basically hugging the transmission. And since the cables were on top of the transmission, I couldn't really see them, so I did have to actually feel around for them, which is a painful thing to do when everything you have to touch and feel is really hot metal. But sure enough, I was able to find the loose shifter cable and reattach it to the bell crank lever on the transmission and be on my way. I wrote the full story for this incident in a blog post on Red Pants, so if you want to read more about what happened, I've got a link to it in the description below. As far as the shifter cables are concerned, I'm not saying all of this to make you afraid of driving hard or having fun with your car. What I am saying is that it's important to know where the shift ends and the damage begins. I share stories like this one and all of this information to help you know more about your car. Hopefully you don't find yourself in this situation. You don't want this to happen to you. But if you do, if your knob goes limp and you think of me, you may be better prepared for how to handle that. I might have to rephrase that part. Aside from these gotchas, the manual transmission is pretty straightforward. Treat it more like a fine bolt-action rifle and less like a hammer, and it's a very rewarding thing to drive. But there is one hang-up that you may experience that can't really be helped much by technique, and that is difficulty shifting between first and second gear when the transmission is cold. This is a common complaint with the earlier V Vantage, so Aston Martin made two changes. One was changing the gear oil, which I'll talk about in my next video, which is going to cover that topic, and the other was altering the bell crank lever on the transmission. The bell crank lever, as I mentioned in that story, sits on top of the transmission at the back of the car, and it's the arm that the shifter cable is attached to. Aston Martin changed it to improve the input leverage when changing gears. The updated bell crank lever was part of a technical service bulletin, that's a TSB, but it was not a recall. So it may or may not have been done to a car prior to the updated part being implemented as standard in production, which I think was sometime in 2007. Regardless of whether you've got a manual or sport shift, the clutch life concerns are going to be the same. It doesn't last long and it's stupid expensive to replace. I talked about the clutch learn procedure when starting a sport shift and about not riding the clutch while shifting a manual. But there's one more huge thing that's directly related to clutch life. It's so huge, in fact, that I consider it to be one of my golden rules for owning an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. Do not reverse uphill. This may seem like an odd small thing, but it really isn't. Reverse gear in a V8 Vantage is incredibly tall. It's more similar to second gear than it is to first. So imagine being on an uphill slope at a complete stop. It takes a bit of attention to get going uphill without either stalling the engine or burning up the clutch. Now imagine doing this in second gear. The likelihood of stalling the engine or burning up the clutch is way higher, and that's what it's like reversing uphill. It's even worse if you've got a sport shift because that car does not want the engine to stall, so the clutch is going to get slipped more, leading to the clutch being burned up really quickly. But regardless of which transmission you have, it's a terrible thing to do in either of them. So do not reverse uphill unless it's absolutely necessary, and avoid getting yourself in this situation where you'll have to as best as you can. Reversing uphill is one of the worst things that you can do to your clutch in an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. It's hard to say whether or not a transmission will be reliable because there's always going to be a lemon out there. Plus, many of the problems the transmissions have are due to the owners, either through ignorance, apathy, or abuse. As far as ignorance is concerned, that often isn't the fault of the owner. If a Sportshift owner was never told about that clutch learn procedure at startup, for example, and that leads to a bunch of clutch issues, it really isn't their fault. I mean, let's be real, how many Sportshift owners do not know about the startup procedure? It's not a normal thing to do in a car, so it shouldn't be expected that someone would do it if they're not explicitly told to. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is that if you're in the market to buy one of these cars and you're not sure which transmission to get, take this one bit of advice. Do not listen to anybody that tells you which one to buy. If you're uncertain about manual or Sportshift, drive both of them yourself. If you drive the Sportshift properly, like I've explained how to do in this video, you may love it. A lot of people do. And if you have trouble driving a manual for any reason, like I sometimes do because I have bad knees, it may be a very viable option for you. So try the manual, try the Sportshift if you're on the fence, and judge it for yourself. Now I want to end this video by circling back to the beginning. Early on I mentioned that Aston Martin has a bad reputation for transmissions, but to be fair, I think they deserve a lot more credit than they get. Aston Martin is one of the few companies out there that tries to offer engaging vehicles even through unconventional means. The V8 Vantage, for example, was built to be a driver's car, and to that end they offered it with two transmission choices, a traditional manual and an automated manual, both manuals. And let's not forget that the Aston Martin V12 Vantage S was the last car on the planet Earth that was offered with a V12 engine and a manual transmission. No other manufacturer does that. So I hope that they get a little bit more credit for the things they do, even if a lot of people perceive that as a downside. All right, so that was a lot of information all at once, but we're not done yet. In my next video, I'll be covering maintenance with an extra focus on the clutch and gear oil options. Even if you're not planning to do your maintenance yourself, the information I'll be sharing will be directly relevant to all V8 Vantage owners, as your choices for your clutch and gear oil will affect your vehicle performance, component longevity, and even how well the transmission shifts. Each of these tying into the things that I just covered in this video, and also being a part of how a transmission performs and your own satisfaction with it. If you've learned something here, please give the video a like, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel. And check out www.redpants.lol for more Aston Martin parts and information. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.